The morning I trusted my wife completely, I learned why I never should have. The house was quiet when I woke up. Sunlight slipped through the blinds like thin, silver threads. Dust hung in the air above the dresser. I lay still for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum. Somewhere down the hall, a pipe clicked like a nervous heartbeat. It felt ordinary, and that comfort held me. My wife was already in the kitchen when I patted out. I smelled coffee before I saw her, dark and sharp. The tile was cold under my bare feet. She stood at the counter, back to me, stirring. Her hair was pulled up, the way she wore it on calm days. I watched her shoulders rise and fall. I remember thinking how normal everything looked. Mugs lined up, toast browning, butter softening on a plate. It was the kind of morning you barely notice. She turned and smiled when she finally saw me. There was warmth in it, familiar and easy. For a second, I felt nothing but love. I crossed the room and kissed her cheek. Her skin smelled faintly like soap and citrus. She laughed softly, a small breath of sound. We talked about nothing important over coffee. The weather, a neighbor's barking dog, weekend errands. It felt like a rhythm we had shared for years. Yet beneath that rhythm, something hovered. Not loud enough to name, just there. A faint tightening in my chest, I ignored. She checked her phone twice while stirring. Her thumb moved quickly, then stilled. I told myself it meant nothing at all. The coffee tasted slightly burnt that morning. A bitter edge lingered on my tongue. I swallowed anyway and smiled back. She placed a mug in front of me carefully. Her hand brushed mine, warm for a heartbeat. I felt grounded, as if anchored to that table. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. Tires hissed against damp pavement. The sound made the kitchen feel smaller. She glanced toward the window, then back to me. For a split second, her expression shifted. It was gone before I could understand it. I told myself I was reading too much. Years together had taught me to trust. That trust felt like a steady floor beneath me. She spoke about plans for the afternoon. Grocery shopping, laundry, maybe a walk. Her voice carried the ease of routine. I nodded and watched steam curl from my cup. It rose like a soft veil between us. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. Still, my gaze kept drifting to her hands. They moved with practiced, careful precision. Too careful, I realized only much later. At the time, I simply admired her. She felt like home standing there. I believed that completely, without question. The clock above the sink ticked steadily. Each second seemed small, harmless, unimportant. I had no idea how much those seconds mattered. She reached for the sugar without looking. A single spoon clinked against porcelain. The tiny sound echoed louder than it should. I took another sip and felt calmer. My shoulders dropped, my breath slowed. In that moment, I trusted her completely. I believed we were aligned in everything. Our past, our present, our quiet future. Nothing felt hidden, or so I thought. She set down the spoon and met my eyes. Her smile returned, gentle and familiar. I smiled back without hesitation. The house felt safe in that shared silence. Warm, ordinary, wrapped in morning light. I let myself rest there emotionally. Somewhere, a bird tapped against the window. The glass trembled for a brief second. Neither of us moved to check it. I remember feeling strangely grateful. Grateful for quiet, for coffee, for her. Grateful for the life we had built. Looking back, that gratitude feels fragile. Like glass warmed just enough to crack. But then it felt solid as stone. She rinsed her mug and placed it aside. Water hissed softly against the sink. I stayed seated, watching her movements. There was intimacy in that simple watching. A quiet connection that felt unbreakable. At least, that is what I believed. When she turned again, she paused. For a heartbeat, something tightened in her face. Then it smoothed, and I relaxed. I finished my coffee slowly. The last sip left warmth in my chest. I set the mug down with care. She leaned against the counter, watching me. Her gaze felt soft, almost protective. I felt seen, understood, secure. In that stillness, the world felt small. Just us, the house, and the morning. Nothing else seemed to exist. I remember thinking this was happiness. Quiet, unremarkable, steady happiness. The kind you don't question. She pushed away from the counter gently. Her footsteps were light on the tile as she moved past me. I stayed seated, breathing in the warm, familiar air around that morning. Trust was never a decision for me. It lived quietly in the walls of our home. I carried it like breath. After coffee, I lingered at the table. My chair creaked beneath me. The wood was warm against my forearms. Morning light pooled across the tile. Dust drifted through it like slow snow. I watched the hallway glow. My wife moved somewhere out of sight. I heard the washer door thud shut. Then the steady rush of water began. To me, trust felt ordinary. Not heroic, not risky, just natural. The way a floor feels solid under your feet. I remember how we started. Two young people on a worn couch. Rain hammering the windows that night. I had told her things I'd never said aloud. Secrets that felt heavy in my chest. Her hand rested calmly on my knee. That memory surfaced gently now. The house smelled like coffee and detergent. I felt anchored to that past version of us. I believed trust grew quietly, layer by layer, morning by morning, built from thousands of small moments. I thought about the arguments we survived, small ones about money or schedules. Even then, I trusted her intent. There was comfort in knowing someone deeply. Her footsteps, her sighs, her pauses. I felt certain I could read her. Still, trust sometimes felt too smooth, like a road without cracks. The thought brushed me, then slipped away. The washer hummed steadily. Pipes rattled faintly behind the walls. The house felt alive around me. I traced the grain of the table. My fingertip followed its winding lines. It grounded me in the present. In that moment, I felt sure of us, sure of our history and our future. The certainty wrapped around me. I replayed small kindnesses in my mind. Notes on the fridge, forgotten errands finished. Tiny proofs of care. Those gestures felt like evidence. Proof our bond was steady. Proof my trust was well placed. Yet a quiet question hovered nearby. What does trust really protect? I brushed it aside without effort. The washer grew louder as it filled. The rhythmic slosh was strangely calming. It matched my breathing. I pushed my chair back and stood. It scraped softly across the tile. The sound made me pause for a heartbeat. I walked to the hallway doorway. Light stretched across the floor in clean strips. My wife sorted clothes inside. Her movements were precise and practiced. Towels in one pile, shirts in another. Everything neat, everything controlled. She didn't look up when I appeared. I studied the curve of her back. Familiar, comforting, unchanged. I realized how much I relied on her. Practically, yes, but emotionally too. She was my steady center. A dryer beeped down the hall. Sharp, cheerful, ordinary. She sighed lightly and turned toward me. For a moment, our eyes met. Calm, steady, unreadable in that familiar way. Warmth moved through my chest. I believed then our trust was mutual, a silent agreement we never named. It felt complete, unshakable. She reached for a towel. Fabric rustled softly in her hands. I stayed where I was, watching her move. Outside, a distant lawnmower started up. The sound barely touched our quiet bubble. Inside, everything felt separate. I stepped closer and leaned against the counter. Cool stone pressed against my back. My reflection blurred faintly. I thought of how vulnerable I'd once been. Afraid to love fully, afraid to be seen. Those fears felt far away. I told myself I'd grown because of her. Because she met me with patience. Because she never judged my softness. Gratitude filled my chest like warm water. Slow, steady, and easy, I breathed it in without thinking. She opened the washer and pulled out wet clothes. They dripped in dark beads onto the tile. Water spread beneath her feet. For a second, the puddles looked like shadows. I noticed, then dismissed it. The morning felt too gentle to question. She laughed softly when a sleeve slipped free. The sound wrapped around me like familiar music. I straightened and watched her move to the dryer. Her steps were light, almost rhythmic. I followed them with my eyes. A brief thought crossed my mind. Do I trust too easily? It drifted past like a passing cloud. What mattered, I believed, was this life. These mornings, this house, this quiet routine. This shared air. The room smelled sharply of detergent now. Clean, ordinary, safe. It pulled me back into the moment. I turned toward the kitchen again. Warmth lingered behind me in the hallway. Trust sat comfortably in my chest. I carried that feeling as I walked. Light steady, unquestioned. It guided me without effort. In that ordinary morning, I trusted her completely. Not carefully, not cautiously, just fully. I let myself rest there. I trusted entirely. We met in late summer, when the air felt thick enough to hold. The parking lot outside the cafe shimmered like glass. Heat rolled off the asphalt in visible waves. I noticed her first because she stood too still. Everyone else rushed, but she watched the street as if waiting for something that never came. A small paper cup trembled in her hand. Inside, the cafe smelled like burnt sugar and bitter espresso. Fans rattled overhead, pushing warm air in lazy circles. I stood behind her in line and studied the back of her head. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot that kept slipping. A few strands curled against her neck, damp from the heat. I remember thinking she looked tired in a quiet way. When she turned, our eyes met by accident. Hers were lighter than I expected, almost translucent in the sun. I felt that awkward jolt you feel before you speak. She smiled first, just a corner of her mouth. It was gentle, not flirtatious. The kind of smile that made her room feel smaller. I ordered two quickly, stumbling over my words. The barista barely looked up. My hands felt suddenly large and clumsy. She stepped aside with her drink and waited. I hovered beside her, unsure where to stand. Steam curled between us like thin fog. We talked about nothing important at first. Traffic, the heat, how crowded the city had become. Her voice was soft but steady. When we walked out together, the sunlight hit me hard. My eyes watered, and she laughed quietly. The sound stayed with me longer than the warmth. We sat on the curb and let cars pass. Her sandals rested lightly on the pavement. I noticed a small scar on her ankle. She told me she liked quiet mornings. I told her I hated noise. We smiled at how simple that felt. That conversation stretched into hours. The sky shifted from bright to honey-colored. The cafe lights flickered on behind us. By dusk, the air cooled just enough to breathe. A breeze carried the smell of cut grass from somewhere nearby. We lingered without saying we were lingering. I walked her to her car. The streetlights buzzed overhead like tired insects. My heart beat too fast in my chest. She handed me her number on a receipt. Ink bled slightly into the paper. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my wallet. Our first date was at a small diner on the edge of town. Neon buzzed in the windows like restless lightning. The counter stools were worn smooth by years of bodies. We talked until our coffee went cold. Cream formed thin skins on top. The waitress refilled our cups without asking. She told me about her childhood house with creaky stairs. I told her about my lonely apartment and thin walls. We laughed at our own awkwardness. When I drove her home, rain began to fall. Drops splattered against the windshield in uneven rhythms. She traced one with her fingertip. Standing on her porch, neither of us wanted to move. The rain soaked my shirt, but I didn't care. Her hand hovered near mine. We kissed under the dripping roof. It was soft, uncertain, real. The kind of kiss that felt like a beginning. After that, we fell into each other slowly. Not dramatically, just steadily. Days turned into weeks without effort. We cooked together in cramped kitchens. Garlic sizzled in hot oil. Smoke alarms screamed when we got careless. We argued over tiny things. Dishes left in the sink, socks on the floor. But we always laughed before it turned sharp. On rainy nights, we lay on the living room floor. Water drummed against the windows. Our fingers intertwined between us. She learned how I took my coffee. I learned the way she twisted her hair when thinking. Small maps of each other formed. When we moved in together, the apartment smelled like fresh paint. Boxes stacked in crooked towers. Dust hung in the air for days. We painted walls late at night, music low. Rollers hissed softly across plaster. Paint flecks dotted our clothes. I remember standing in the empty bedroom, holding her waist. Moonlight slipped through thin blinds. We felt like a promise. Marriage came naturally, almost casually. We didn't plan a big wedding, just a small ceremony in a courthouse. The room smelled faintly of wood polish. Sunlight cut clean lines across the floor. Our family sat quietly in folding chairs. When the judge asked if we were ready, she squeezed my hand. Her palm was warm and slightly damp. I felt anchored. We said our vows simply. No poetry, No grand speeches. Just honest words that fit like worn shoes. Outside, sirens drifted faintly across the warm summer afternoon. By the time we bought our first house, the strangeness arrived quietly. It sat at the end of a curved street, a fading gray place that changed color with the light. The front steps creaked every time we climbed them. We painted the door deep blue because she loved that shade. Fresh paint hung thick in the warm afternoon air. My hands were sticky, and she laughed at the mess I made. Inside, the rooms echoed like they were still waiting for us to fill them. Footsteps sounded sharper on the bare hardwood. Dust drifted lazily through bright strips of sunlight. For months, everything felt like a beginning. We unpacked slowly, living out of boxes longer than necessary. I enjoyed watching her arrange things with careful intention. Then small changes began to surface. She started placing her phone face down on every table. It vibrated silently far more than it used to. At night, she carried it into the bathroom with her. The fan hummed through the thin walls while I lay awake listening. I told myself it was only privacy. Sometimes she stepped onto the back porch to take calls. I'd see her shadow pacing behind the glass. Her voice stayed low and clipped. When I asked casually who she was talking to, she smiled too fast. "Work," she said while scrubbing a plate too hard. The water hissed sharply in the sink. There were moments when she seemed distant, staring past me as if I weren't there. Her gaze slid through the room without landing anywhere. I felt suddenly small. At dinner one evening, she forgot to pass the salt. Her hand hovered inches from it while her phone lit up across the counter. My food cooled untouched. I noticed she began locking her screen constantly. The tiny click of the button felt loud in the quiet kitchen. It echoed longer than it should have. Other shifts were softer. She stopped humming while she cooked. The house felt slightly colder without that sound. She also rearranged drawers I rarely opened. Towels folded differently, utensils moved, order without explanation. It felt precise, almost nervous. One afternoon, I found a plain notebook hidden behind cleaning supplies. No name, no date, just blank beige cover. I slid it back without reading. Still, I insisted these were habits, not warnings. Couples change, routines shift, people grow. I clung to that thought tightly, yet my body reacted before my mind did. My stomach tightened whenever her phone buzzed. My breath caught when she turned away mid-sentence. While we watched television one night, she muted the show abruptly. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise. She stared at the dark screen. I studied her profile in the bluish light. Her jaw was set, lips pressed thin. The room smelled faintly of burnt popcorn. When the sound returned, she laughed a beat too late. The laugh felt slightly wrong, like music out of tune. I laughed anyway. There were nights she came to bed long after me. I lay in darkness, listening to her move through the house. Floorboards whispered beneath her feet. From the bedroom, I heard the faucet start and stop. Cabinets opening, closing, reopening. Ordinary sounds that somehow fell off. She slipped in beside me eventually, cool and quiet. Her back turned away, breathing steady. I stared at the ceiling until sleep came. By morning, she was herself again. Coffee brewing, sunlight soft, routine restored. The unease dissolved like fog. I wanted to believe that pattern more than anything. Unsettled at night, normal by day. A rhythm I convinced myself was temporary. Yet one moment stayed, lodged in my memory. A Saturday of hard rain, gutters spilling dark water. The garage smelled like oil and cardboard. We were sorting boxes, dust coating the air in my tone. Her phone buzzed atop an old toolbox. I reached to hand it to her. She moved too quickly and snatched it from my hand. Our fingers brushed for a heartbeat, her skin startlingly cold. Her eyes flickered wide. I froze, surprised more than hurt. She glanced at the screen, then at me, something unreadable passing over her face. Rain pounded the roof. "I've got it," she said sharply, sliding the phone into her pocket. The silence between us felt thin and brittle. I forced a small laugh to smooth the moment. She offered a tight smile. We returned to our boxes without speaking. That night, lying beside her, real doubt settled into my chest. Not loud, just heavy like a stone I couldn't shift. Rain slid steadily down the windows. Her back was warm against the sheets. I stared upward, wide awake. When morning came, I pushed the feeling aside. The house smelled like coffee and safety. I chose trust without questioning that morning. Tea happened on a Saturday that looked ordinary from the outside. The sky was wash-pale blue, almost colorless. A faint breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass. We had slept in longer than usual. Sheets were tangled around my legs. My mouth tasted stale with sleep. When I reached the kitchen, sunlight poured across the counter in clean strips. The coffee maker gurgled softly like it always did. My wife stood very still beside it. She held her phone in both hands. Her thumbs hovered, but did not move. Steam curled up between us like thin fog. I said good morning too loudly. My voice bounced off the cabinets. She startled, just slightly, then turned. Her smile arrived a beat late. Polite practice, not unkind. I pretended not to notice. She set the phone face down with deliberate care. It clicked against the granite. The sound felt sharper than it should. I poured myself coffee and leaned against the island. Heat seeped through the mug into my palms. I watched her breathe. She rinsed a single spoon again and again. Water hissed in a narrow stream. The spoon gleamed like new metal. I joked about how clean it already was. She laughed, but her eyes stayed fixed on the sink. My chest tightened without reason. We moved around each other in quiet choreography. Cabinet, drawe, kunte. Our steps never collided. At one point, her phone buzzed softly. She didn't look at it. Her jaw tightened instead. The moment felt small, forgettable. Just another beat in an ordinary morning. I told myself it meant nothing. Later, in the bedroom, I searched for my watch. Sunlight warmed the carpet under my knees. Dust clung to my fingertips. The nightstand drawer stuck halfway open. I tugged harder, wood scraping wood. Something shifted inside. A slim envelope slid forward without warning. Plain white. No name, no address. My pulse jumped. I stared at it longer than I should have. The paper looked too clean for that messy drawer. Too intentional. My wife appeared in the doorway behind me. The floorboard creaked under her weight. I felt her presence before I saw her. "Find anything?" she asked lightly. Her tone was casual, almost playful. I turned slowly. Her face was calm, but her hands were clasped too tightly. Knuckles pale, veins drawn sharp. The room felt smaller. I held up the envelope without opening it. It felt thin, almost weightless. It pressed heavy in my palm. For a heartbeat, something flickered across her face. Not anger, not fear. Something harder to name. She crossed the room and took it from me. Her fingers brushed mine, cool and quick. The contact startled me. "It's nothing," she said, slipping it into her robe pocket. Fabric swallowed it without sound. Her smile returned. I laughed softly to ease the tension. My own voice sounded hollow. She tilted her head, watching me. The air smelled faintly of detergent and warm cotton. Sunlight slid across the bed in golden sheets. It felt intimate. I wanted to ask what was inside. The question sat on my tongue like a stone. I swallowed it instead. She leaned in and kissed my forehead. Her lips were dry and warm. The gesture felt protective, almost tender. "Don't worry so much," she murmured. Her breath brushed my skin. I nodded automatically. After she left the room, I sat on the edge of the bed. Springs creaked beneath me. My reflection wavered in the mirror. I replayed the moment again and again. The envelope, her hands, that flicker. Each detail felt heavier. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. Couples keep small secrets. That thought felt like a soft blanket. Downstairs, I heard her humming again, low and familiar. The sound wound up the stairs toward me. I stood and straightened to comfort her. My palms smoothed wrinkles into nothing. The room grew calmer. When I returned to the kitchen, she handed me toast. Butter melted in uneven patches. Steam rose gently. We ate at the table without speaking. Forks scraped softly against plates. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. She caught my eye once and smiled. This time it felt warmer. I relaxed into it like a chair. The envelope slipped from my mind as quickly as it had appeared. Ordinary life pulled me back in. We made plans for the afternoon. Grocery store, laundry, maybe a walk. She sounded like herself again. Yet when she reached for her phone, she turned its screen down first. My chest tightened before I could stop it. I noticed, then dismissed it. Old habits linger, I told myself. Trust doesn't vanish over paper. After breakfast, she stacked dishes with neat precision. Plates aligned, cups nested, everything in its place. I leaned against the counter and watched. The morning stretched longer than I realized. Sun slid higher, bleaching the kitchen into bright calm. I felt wrapped in that light, like a promise. My wife said she was stepping out to run errands. Keys chimed in her hand, sharp and cheerful. Her shoes clicked lightly across the tile. She kissed my cheek at the door. I smelled detergent in her hair. The latch snapped closed behind her with ordinary finality. The house grew suddenly too quiet. Even the refrigerator seemed to pause. Dust hung motionless in the shafts of light. I wandered back to the bedroom without purpose. The carpet felt warm beneath my feet. My watch still sat missing on the dresser. I opened the nightstand again almost by accident. The drawer slid easier this time. Wood whispered against wood. The empty space where the envelope had been looked too clean. No dust, no clutter, just a pale rectangle of memory. My chest tightened before I could stop it. I told myself it was nothing. My hand hovered over the drawer anyway. Something thin caught my fingertip at the back corner. Paper, folded small, tucked where eyes rarely linger. I pulled it free slowly. It was the same envelope, creased now, edges softened by handling. My breath grew shallow. For a long moment, I simply stared. Sunlight slipped across the surface, revealing faint indentations of writing beneath. I sat on the edge of the bed. Springs creaked under my weight. The room smelled faintly of warm cotton. My fingers trembled as I slid one nail beneath the flap. Paper peeled apart with a soft, intimate sound. Inside was a single printed page. Clean black text. No signature, no explanation. Just words arranged too carefully. The first lines fell harmless. Dates, locations, brief descriptions. Ordinary on the surface, unsettling underneath. Then I saw my name. Not once, but several times, threaded through every paragraph like a quiet thread. My throat tightened. I read slower, tracing each sentence with my eyes as if it might change if I rushed. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't angry. It was clinical, observant, almost detached. That made it worse. There were details only she would know. My routines, my habits, my small tells, written like notes in a study. I felt suddenly exposed, as if walls had vanished. Sunlight seemed too bright, the room too open. My pulse thudded in my ears. I flipped the page, hands slick with sweat. Paper rustled loudly in the silence. The second page shifted tone. Less observation, more intention. Words about plans, timing, and distance. A single phrase made my stomach drop. When he trusts most. The letters burned against the white. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. The mattress dipped, pulling me downward. My breath came shallow. Images from past months collided in my mind. The porch calls, the locked screen, the notebook behind cleaners. Each memory rearranged itself into something darker, clearer. The pattern snapped into place with painful ease. I looked at the window. Curtains stirred faintly in a warm breeze. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. For a moment, I considered tearing the page apart. My fingers curled around the edge, paper bending sharply. Instead, I folded it exactly as it had been. Creases lined up with quiet precision, almost reverent. I slid the envelope back into its hiding place. The drawer swallowed it like it had never existed. Then I sat very still, listening to the house breathe. Pipes ticked softly behind the walls. Something inside me shifted from hurt to clarity. Not calm, exactly, but focus sharpened. I realized this had not been accidental. Nothing about it felt careless anymore. Trust, I understood, had been part of the design, not the foundation. That thought landed cold. I stood slowly, legs weak, knees unsteady. The floor felt suddenly unfamiliar beneath me. In the mirror, my face looked older. Eyes darker, mouth pressed tight. I barely recognized myself. I walked to the dresser and found my watch where it had always been. The second hand ticked relentlessly. I fastened it around my wrist with careful movements. Metal felt cool against my skin. Downstairs, the house remained empty. Her coffee cup still rested in the sink, thin ring staining porcelain. I rinsed it out mechanically. Water hissed over ceramic. My reflection wavered in the stainless steel. The ordinariness of the act felt surreal. Dishes, sunlight, ticking clock, all moving forward as if nothing had changed. Yet everything inside me had shifted. A line had been crossed without my permission. I dried my hands slowly on a towel she had folded that morning. Fabric was soft, faintly scented. In that softness, I felt something hard take shape. Not rage, not despair, but resolve. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. The house held. I went back over everything in my mind the way detectives do in old crime shows, slowly, patiently, as if the truth were a hidden pattern instead of a wound. At first, the pieces didn't fit. My husband had always seemed ordinary in the safest possible way. Predictable, reliable. The kind of man who packed lunch in neat plastic containers, paid bills early, and double-checked the locks at night. Betrayal, I had believed, belonged to messier people than us. But as I sat alone in the quiet house, the memories began to rearrange themselves. I replayed every late night he claimed was work, every hushed phone call he took in the bathroom, every time his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Each moment I had brushed off as stress now glowed with a different, uglier light. The air in the living room felt thinner, like it had been stretched too far. I walked to the kitchen and ran my fingers along the edge of the counter where we used to sit together with coffee. I could almost see us there, laughing, planning vacations, arguing about paint colors, while something rotten festered just beneath the surface. I realized, with a chill, how carefully he had constructed his image. Not cruel, not distant, just enough affection to keep me calm, just enough secrecy to keep me blind. I thought of the night our daughter was sick and I begged him to stay home. He had kissed my forehead, said he was sorry, and left anyway. I had told myself that was what responsible men did. Now I wondered if that night had been a lie too. I moved through the house like a stranger, noticing details I had ignored for years. The locked drawer in his study, the missing photographs, the way certain rooms felt emptier when he was gone. Every step tightened the knot in my chest. In the hallway, I paused outside her bedroom. The door was ajar, just as I had left it. A pale strip of daylight slipped across the floor like a blade. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to keep my composure. I pictured our wedding day, the vows, the promises, the certainty that love meant safety, that marriage meant truth, that I could trust the person sleeping beside me. That certainty had shattered. In my mind, scenes stacked up like broken mirrors. His carefully timed arrivals home, the vague explanations, the way he avoided my questions with gentle deflection instead of anger. Gentleness, I realized, could be another kind of cruelty. I walked to his study and opened the drawer he rarely let me touch. Inside were papers I didn't recognize, names, dates, addresses that meant nothing to me yet felt deeply dangerous. My hands trembled as I skimmed them. For the first time, I saw how much I had missed by choosing comfort over curiosity. The house creaked around me, settling like an old ship. Somewhere a pipe rattled. Outside, a car passed slowly down our street. Nothing felt familiar anymore. I sat at his desk and imagined confronting him, my voice steady, his eyes darting, the truth spilling out too late to save us. But the image brought no satisfaction, only exhaustion. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. Instead, I gathered the scattered thoughts in my head the way one might gather fragile glass. Carefully, knowing each piece could cut. Every lie, every half-truth, every unanswered question formed a picture I didn't want to see. But I had to see it. I rose slowly and stepped back into the hallway. Dust floated in the light like tiny witnesses to everything that had happened in this house. The house. The hallway stretched quietly behind me. I stepped forward with deliberate care. Each footfall slow, measured. My hands felt steadier now. My thoughts sharper, less scattered. Where I had left it, the house felt unnaturally quiet. If you want, I can continue with Section 8 in the same tone, pacing, an exact 800-word format. That'd be why the time I pieced the puzzle together, the house no longer felt like mine. Every wall, every floorboard, Every light switch seemed to hum with secrets I had never known. The morning sunlight looked almost hostile, cutting across the rooms in harsh angles that made everything feel sharper. I went back through the day-to-day routines I had taken for granted. Coffee at the same time, dishes stacked neatly, walks in the evening. Every one of those ordinary moments now carried a hidden weight, a lie hovering just beneath the surface. I remember the notebook I had found months ago, tucked behind cleaning supplies. At the time, I had dismissed it, told myself it was nothing. Now, with the envelope in my hands, the dots connected painfully. It had never been nothing. It had been a warning I had refused to see. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It wasn't just a few moments of weakness. It was an entire pattern, carefully constructed, hidden in plain sight. I could trace it across weeks, months, even years. My trust had been manipulated, measured, and exploited from the very beginning. I walked from room to room, trying to breathe. The house smelled faintly of detergent and sun-warmed wood. It should have smelled safe, comforting, but instead it reeked of deception. I noticed the way the light fell on the staircase, and for a second, I saw it differently. Every step a record of misdirection, every shadow a reminder that I had been blind. Her footsteps echoed upstairs in the early afternoon. I froze. The sound normally would have been comforting. Now it felt like an intrusion. I listened to the slow rhythm of her steps, tracing them back in my mind, trying to imagine what else had been orchestrated, how much had been performed while I trusted blindly. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee cup. The liquid had cooled, leaving a thin ring on the ceramic. I traced the edge with my fingertip, each rotation a silent counting of moments I had been deceived. I thought about the nights she had said she was tired, staying late at work, or taking calls I thought were mundane. Each excuse was now suspect. The dinners, the casual laughter, the small gestures of kindness. They had all been carefully timed, rehearsed to maintain the illusion. The sense of violation settled in slowly, like a stone in my chest. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was the weight of awareness pressing down relentlessly. I could not ignore it. I could not return to ignorance. I moved through the house again, touching surfaces lightly, almost cautiously. Her coffee mug, the folded laundry, the stack of mail I had never opened. Everything felt like it belonged to someone I didn't really know, someone who had lived alongside me while concealing a part of herself I had never been allowed to see. I remembered her smile that morning, so natural and effortless. It had been a mask, perfectly calibrated. Every blink, every tilt of the head, every casual laugh. It was all part of the design. I realized I'd been studying the wrong things all along. Not the habits, not the routines, but the patterns beneath them. The subtle deviations, the little pauses, the microsecond hesitations I had ignored. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but it was calm, controlled. I was not thinking about revenge yet. I was thinking about clarity, about understanding exactly how far it went. I retraced conversations in my mind, picking apart every answer, every omission, every word that seemed off at the time. Now, each made perfect sense. The puzzle had a shape, and it was darker than I could have imagined. I thought of the envelope again, the printed page, the precise details. It wasn't sloppy. It wasn't chaotic. It was intentional, meticulous, and entirely planned. I realized I had underestimated her, not in terms of cleverness, but in terms of how far someone could go while hiding in plain sight. The realization was humbling, sharp, and almost painful. Every instinct I had ever had about trust, about love, about intimacy felt tested. The foundation of my marriage, the quiet rhythms we had built together, now seemed built on sand, easily shifted by the tides of deception. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the street. Cars passed slowly, oblivious. The world continued moving as if nothing had happened. Inside, I was hyper-aware of everything. The ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the staircase. I knew then that this was not a simple betrayal. It was comprehensive. It reached into the structure of our lives, into routines I had thought safe. Every day I had lived with her, I had unknowingly participated in her plan, trusting entirely. The realization was both terrifying and oddly empowering. Terrifying because it confirmed the extent of her manipulation. Empowering because awareness gave me something I hadn't had before: control over my next steps. I sat back in the chair, letting the weight of comprehension settle. Clarity came with a cold edge. I could see what had been hidden, understand the method, and finally recognize the pattern for what it was. For the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of strategy. Not confrontation, not panic, but careful, deliberate thought. The scope of the betrayal was larger than I had imagined, but it was now visible, mapped in my mind like a blueprint. And for the first time, I realized I could act with intention. My trust had been weaponized, but now that weapon had been disarmed by awareness. I could choose my response. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle. The house breathed around me, ordinary yet charged with hidden truths. And in that quiet, I made a decision. I would not be naive anymore. I would not be blind again. I was no longer just hurt. I was watching. I was calculating. I was ready. After the envelope and the realization of how far the deception ran, everything about her became different in my eyes. The casual comfort I had felt for years evaporated like mist in sunlight. I saw her movements as deliberate now, each one layered with meaning I had never suspected before. She entered the kitchen one morning, humming softly like she always did. The sound, once comforting, now struck me as almost performative. I studied the way her shoulders moved, the tilt of her head, the timing of her steps. It was as though every gesture had a hidden purpose I had never noticed before. Her coffee cup sat on the counter, half full. She picked it up, glanced at me, and smiled. That smile used to warm me. Now it was a mask, perfectly timed, carefully measured, hiding more than it revealed. I began paying attention to the small details I had ignored in the past. The slight hesitation when she answered a question, the way she tapped her fingers on the table, the way she glanced at her phone even when there was no message. Subtle, almost imperceptible behaviors that now shouted volumes. She moved through the house with that familiar ease, but I felt like an outsider, watching her like a stranger. Every laugh, every sigh, every tilt of her head became a clue. I cataloged them in my mind, analyzing patterns, testing my own interpretations. The ordinary chores she performed suddenly felt like rehearsals. Folding laundry, putting dishes away, watering the plants. Each act was deliberate, almost performative, and I couldn't tell which was genuine and which was part of the deception. I noticed her energy differently too. She seemed lighter when I wasn't looking, movements more fluid, a subtle brightness in her expression. And yet, when our eyes met, she froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice the change. It was brief, but revealing. I watched her laugh at the television show we usually enjoyed together. It was a genuine laugh, but the timing felt off, as if she had rehearsed it for my benefit. I began to catalog every laugh, every smile, every casual gesture, like notes in a ledger. Her phone became the center of my attention, not because I wanted to invade privacy, but because it was a tool she had used to hide the truth. I observed how she picked it up, how she placed it down, how her thumbs hovered over the screen. Small habits, barely noticeable, but revealing when placed in context. I began noticing inconsistencies. A time she said she'd been at the grocery store when receipts suggested otherwise. A comment about a coworker that didn't line up with later details. Small threads that, when tied together, formed a rope I could follow. It wasn't paranoia. I wasn't imagining it. It was methodical observation. I was seeing her clearly for the first time, unfiltered by trust or assumption. I also noticed how she responded when I entered rooms unexpectedly. Subtle shifts in her posture, a fraction of hesitation in her step, a glance toward a hidden object, tiny cracks in the mask she wore so well. Sometimes she carried herself as if alone. Her energy was freer, lighter, unguarded. But when I observed her, a subtle tension returned. It was as if she knew the audience had shifted. She was no longer performing for me entirely. I began keeping mental notes. Time of day, location, her mood, her gestures. It was almost like a game, though darker, more serious. I wasn't trying to catch her in lies. I was learning the architecture of her deception. Every day, I felt less like a partner and more like a silent observer. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. The realization of the scope of her betrayal demanded attention. I could no longer participate blindly. Her expressions, once comforting, now carried double meanings. A smile might hide a secret. A frown might conceal satisfaction. I learned to read the pauses, the slight inflections in her voice, the way she lingered over mundane tasks. The house itself changed in my perception. Rooms I'd walked through countless times suddenly felt charged, layered with intent and history I hadn't recognized. Every doorway, every piece of furniture, every sound became part of the larger puzzle I was piecing together. Even the way she interacted with our routines now struck me differently. Making coffee, watering plants, folding laundry, it was all deliberate, carefully orchestrated, and I watched it unfold like a performance I had been blind to for years. I began timing her movements, noting patterns in her schedule. Where she went, when she went, how long she stayed. Each small observation added to the map of her behavior I was constructing in my mind. It was a strange shift in perspective. I didn't feel hatred yet, not fully. There was hurt, confusion, shock, but mostly a need to understand, to see clearly, to know without assumption. And as I watched her that morning, moving through the kitchen with grace and precision, I realized that knowledge was power. Seeing her truly for the first time meant I could finally navigate this reality with my eyes wide open. The ordinary world around us, the hum of the refrigerator, the sunlight spilling across the countertops, the distant sound of children playing outside, felt quieter, sharper, more charged. I was no longer naive, no longer blind. I had shifted from partner to observer, from trusting spouse to quiet strategist. And in that shift, I began to feel the first stirrings of something I hadn't yet allowed myself to name: resolve. The morning light continued to pour in, illuminating her movements as I watched. Each gesture, each sigh, each glance became a piece of the story I was now determined to understand fully. And in that quiet, deliberate watching, I felt the first spark of clarity, painful, focused, and unflinching. I would not be deceived again. By mid-afternoon, the weight of what I had discovered pressed down on me like a physical force. The quiet house felt heavier, each tick of the clock marking time I would never get back. I could no longer ignore the patterns, the inconsistencies, the carefully hidden actions that had been right in front of me for years. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug, tracing the rim absent-mindedly. My mind replayed the envelope, the notebook, the inconsistencies in her stories. Every small detail lining up into a picture I hadn't wanted to see, but could no longer deny. The realization struck fully then. This wasn't a simple betrayal. It was an ongoing deception, a life carefully constructed to hide motives I could only begin to imagine. My pulse raced, my stomach knotted, and for the first time in months, I felt completely alone, even in a house we had built together. I thought about the mornings we had shared, the laughter, the routine, the tiny proofs of affection I had taken for granted. Every one of them now felt like a carefully designed performance, a mask meant to keep me comfortable while she manipulated reality behind the scenes. And yet, beneath the hurt and shock, a certain clarity began to emerge. I could see her motives, the logic of her actions, the care she had taken to orchestrate every step without exposing herself. It was almost brilliant in its precision, if it weren't so deeply personal and destructive. I went through the house methodically, retracing my own steps, noting places where she had been, where I had been, and how our paths had intersected. Every object, every surface, every habit was now laden with potential meaning. The coffee mug I had held, the folded laundry, the placement of chairs, they all told a story I had been blind to. I remembered the way she had spoken that morning, the delayed smiles, the carefully measured gestures. I now recognized the subtle signals, The micro pauses, the almost imperceptible adjustments that had been her way of maintaining control without confrontation. I thought about our bedroom, the nightstand, the drawer where I had found the envelope. Every element felt charged with significance. Even the floorboards had a new weight in my mind, each creak a signal I had failed to read at the time. I walked to the living room and sat on the couch. Sunlight streamed through the blinds in sharp lines, illuminating the dust motes that had been invisible before. I let my mind replay every memory, every conversation, every smile, every excuse that now rang hollow. My anger was still low, simmering beneath the surface. It was less about revenge in that moment and more about understanding. I needed to see the full scope of her actions, the extent of her planning, and the depth of her betrayal. Then it hit me. The scale was far greater than I had imagined. It wasn't just a hidden lie. It was a life built in secret, parallel to ours, meticulously maintained to preserve her image while undermining my trust. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. There was no room for denial anymore. No comforting illusions, no excuses, no forgiveness. Not yet. The truth was laid bare, and I had to confront it fully before deciding my next move. I went to her study, a room she had always used as her private space. Papers, books, and small personal items were arranged neatly, almost obsessively. I rifled through them carefully, taking mental notes rather than acting impulsively. Each document revealed subtle hints I hadn't noticed before. Her handwriting, her meticulous lists, the timing of her notes, they all pointed to a precision I had underestimated. She had orchestrated her deception in layers, insulating herself from discovery while maintaining the illusion of ordinary life. I sat back in her chair, feeling the contours of the leather against my palms. The room smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. I realized then that I had been living alongside someone who was simultaneously intimate and unknowable, someone whose trustworthiness I had mistaken for transparency. My mind circled the implications. How long had this been going on? Would have been intentional? Would have been left unsaid to protect her secrets? Each question made my chest tighten further, but also sharpened my focus. I began formulating a mental map of events, actions, and patterns. I traced the outlines of her deception with deliberate attention, cataloging everything I had seen and suspected. This wasn't paranoia. It was strategy, a way to regain control in a life suddenly unmoored. Outside, the sunlight had shifted to a warmer, heavier tone. Shadows stretched across the room, falling over her desk like long, silent witnesses. I felt both exposed and empowered, caught between vulnerability and newfound awareness. I realized I could no longer participate blindly in our marriage. I would have to observe, to understand, to anticipate every move. Trust, once freely given, had become conditional, earned only through action, transparency, and accountability. By the time she returned home, I was waiting calmly. Not accusatory, not panicked, simply aware. Every detail, every nuance, every micro-expression I had cataloged would now guide my responses. The betrayal had shifted the balance of power. But for the first time, I understood the rules of the game, and I was ready to play on my own terms. The house, quiet and ordinary on the surface, now felt like a chessboard. I sat back, observing, calculating, fully awake for the first time in years. I was no longer naive. I was no longer blind, and I would never be caught off guard again. After that afternoon, nothing felt normal anymore. The house, the routines, even the air seemed charged with tension I hadn't noticed before. Every sound carried weight. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the subtle squeak of the stairs under her feet. Each noise reminded me that the calm we once shared had been an illusion. I began noticing her patterns with increasing clarity. She moved through rooms in specific sequences, left certain doors slightly ajar, kept her phone angled away from my view. Small, seemingly insignificant actions now felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. I cataloged them silently, tracking them like a detective in a case I hadn't volunteered for. I found myself timing her errands and phone calls, comparing them with previous days. Every deviation from her routine became a potential clue. A grocery trip that lasted 15 minutes instead of 25, a text she sent that she deleted too quickly. Each detail mattered. My world had narrowed to a single focus: observation. Her energy shifted too. There were moments when she was radiant, almost carefree, like nothing had happened, and then other moments when she stiffened slightly, just enough for me to notice. The pauses in her speech, the subtle hesitation before laughter, the way her gaze flickered, I memorized them all. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was survival, mental and emotional. I had to understand her, to anticipate her, because the trust that had once been effortless was gone. I could no longer assume she would act in good faith. Every interaction carried hidden stakes. One evening, she cooked dinner as usual, moving smoothly through the kitchen. But I noticed a faint change. She washed her hands repeatedly, drying them on the same towel, over and over, as if performing a ritual only she understood. Her smile, normally warm and inviting, felt carefully measured. I didn't speak. I simply observed. Later, when she carried plates to the table, she paused slightly at the doorway, glancing toward the living room. It was a subtle hesitation, a momentary break in her usual rhythm. I felt a flicker of recognition. Something was being concealed, and I had learned to see it. At night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening. The faucet turned on in the bathroom. A drawer clicked closed in the kitchen. The back door creaked slightly. I didn't move, only registered the sounds. Each creak, each tap, each faint shuffle became a piece of information. I realized the betrayal was expanding, not in grand gestures, but in its meticulous, invisible influence over the life we had shared. I had been living beside a stranger, someone who knew me intimately, yet withheld the truth with precision. Even her laughter during television shows became suspect. I studied its timing, comparing it to previous evenings. The pauses, the intonation, the way she glanced at me before smiling. They were all part of a carefully constructed performance. It hit me that my perception was changing. I no longer saw her as just my spouse. I saw her as an opponent, someone who had learned to conceal intentions, manipulate appearances, and operate undetected. I wasn't angry yet, not fully. I was aware. That awareness carried power. I began documenting subtle inconsistencies mentally, making a timeline of events and behaviors. Late nights, altered routines, phone habits, unexplained absences, all converging into a pattern I could finally recognize. It wasn't chaos. It was deliberate, and I could map it. The tension built gradually. Small confrontations, small misunderstandings, previously shrugged off, now seemed charged with significance. Each argument, each disagreement, was a thread I could follow to see the larger picture of her concealment. Her gestures, once comforting, now carried layered meanings. A brush of her hand, a tilt of her head, the way she positioned herself in a room, they all communicated. Subtly, intentionally, in ways I'd been blind to before. By now, my observation had turned near constant. I watched without touching, noted without speaking. She carried on her life, unaware that I had shifted roles, from partner to strategist, from trusting spouse to keen observer. I felt a mixture of dread and clarity. Dread because the extent of the deception was far greater than I had imagined. Clarity because I could now see it fully, anticipate her actions, and prepare myself mentally for the inevitable reckoning. I began planning small, calculated adjustments in my own behavior. Nothing aggressive, nothing reckless. Just careful positioning, preparing to respond intelligently when the truth fully emerged. Sleep became fragmented. My dreams were punctuated by flashes of conversations, gestures, and the subtle sounds of the house at night. Yet I felt sharper, more alert. Awareness had replaced ignorance, and with it came a strange sense of control. By the end of that week, the escalation had crystallized. The betrayal was no longer hidden behind small hints and half-truths. It had taken on a tangible presence in our shared space, and I was no longer naive enough to ignore it. I was ready to watch, to understand, and eventually to act. The calm before confrontation had arrived, and I was standing in it fully aware, every sense heightened, every instinct tuned to what was coming next. That I could see happen on a Sunday morning, quiet and ordinary at first. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in soft streaks, dust motes dancing lazily in the warm air. I had spent the night awake, reviewing everything I had noticed, the phone habits, the subtle hesitations, the unusual absences. Every detail now pointed toward a single, terrifying possibility. The betrayal was bigger than I had ever imagined. She came down the stairs humming, her energy light and carefree, as if nothing had changed. But I could feel the tension in the air, the invisible charge of knowledge I now carried. I watched her in silence, cataloging the gestures, the pace of her steps, the casual tilt of her head. Every movement was deliberate, every smile a performance she thought I hadn't analyzed. She poured herself coffee and turned to me with that same practiced warmth. "Good morning," she said, her voice smooth, but I noticed the split-second delay in her eye contact, the smallest, yet unmistakable flicker of hesitation. I didn't respond immediately. I simply sipped my own coffee, letting the silence stretch, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Then she mentioned a name I hadn't heard in years, a friend from before we met. She spoke casually, but the way she glanced at the table, at her phone, at me, felt calculated. That tiny shift made my stomach tighten. I asked her gently about the person. She hesitated, just a heartbeat, and I recognized it instantly. A pause that revealed more than her words ever could. She had been lying, hiding a truth that stretched far beyond anything I had suspected. The next moment was quiet but decisive. I saw the phone she had been keeping screened down on the counter. I moved toward it slowly, deliberately, watching her reactions. Her hand twitched ever so slightly. She tried to intercept it, saying something casual, but it was too late. I already knew. The truth sprawled across the screen in emails, messages, and confirmations. Multiple conversations, coordinated plans, evidence of intentions I hadn't imagined. Every word confirmed what I had been piecing together. It wasn't just a secret life. It wasn't a momentary betrayal. It was an ongoing scheme that had been happening under my very eyes. The realization hit like a cold wind, sharp and brutal. She froze, eyes widening, realizing I had discovered the extent of her deception. That single expression, shock, fear, calculation, revealed everything she had tried to hide. I stood silently, letting her absorb the weight of her own actions. The coffee steamed between us, untouched, forgotten. The house seemed to hold its breath along with me. The emails detailed interactions with people I had never met, plans that intersected with my life in ways she had carefully concealed. Dates lined up with nights she said she was working late. Meetings corresponded to moments I had thought were ordinary. Every small inconsistency now made perfect sense. I felt the betrayal deepen in my chest, a cold, hard knot forming that demanded recognition. The warmth, intimacy, and trust of years felt like a fragile veneer, ripped away in the span of a few seconds. Yet beneath the hurt and shock, a strange clarity emerged. I could see her methods, the strategies she had employed, the careful orchestration that had kept me blind. Awareness had replaced naivety, and with it came a sharp edge of control. I noticed her shifting subtly, trying to recalibrate, trying to gauge my reaction. But I'd already processed everything, every nuance, every intention. Her attempts to influence or explain fell flat against the weight of the truth I now held. I asked her a simple question, calm and steady. Why? She faltered, searching for words, but no explanation could undo what had been done. The revelation didn't explode into yelling or violence. It settled like dust, thick and suffocating. The house felt smaller, tighter, every corner reflecting the deception that had been hidden in plain sight. I realized, painfully, that this truth wasn't just about lies or secrecy. It was about trust, about the foundation of our shared life. That foundation had been compromised in ways I had only begun to understand. Her shoulders slumped, a rare crack in the mask she had worn for years. The confident, carefree energy dissolved into something human. Fear, shame, desperation. But the pattern had already been laid bare. I felt the intensity of the moment, the emotional gravity of years of trust dismantled. The coffee had gone cold, the sunlight shifted, and the quiet house bore witness to the unraveling. In that moment, I understood fully. She had been living a double life, orchestrating actions, hiding intentions, and manipulating reality with precision. My awareness now leveled the playing field, and I could see everything clearly for the first time. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to cry. I simply absorbed the truth, letting it settle, letting the enormity of her betrayal imprint on my consciousness. The room felt charged, almost alive, with the presence of concealed intentions finally revealed. I knew that from this moment forward, nothing would be the same. For the first time, I realized that clarity was my most powerful tool. Knowledge of the truth, precise and undeniable, gave me a quiet strength I hadn't possessed before. And with that realization came the first stirrings of strategy. Not revenge yet, not confrontation yet, but preparation, observation, and the certainty that I would no longer be deceived. The morning light continued to filter through the blinds, illuminating her face and mine equally. The veil had lifted. The betrayal had been exposed. And I was awake to it now, fully and irreversibly. The truth, once uncovered, didn't end with betrayal alone. It opened a door to a reality I hadn't expected. I had assumed her deception was selfish, personal, perhaps even reckless. But as I pieced together the evidence, the scope of her motives revealed something far more intricate, far more deliberate. It began with the small clues I had cataloged over weeks. The timing of calls, the messages I'd glimpsed on her screen, the subtle patterns in her behavior. Each one pointed toward something I had never considered. This wasn't just a secret life. It was a calculated plan designed to test me, to see how far she could push boundaries without me noticing. I remembered the envelope, the printed page that had first shocked me. The level of detail, the documentation of my habits, my routines, and my reactions, it was meticulous. The realization hit. She had been observing me as closely as I was now observing her. Her deception wasn't sloppy, it was precise. Then I saw the connections. The messages she sent weren't random. The nights she worked late weren't accidental. Every interaction had a purpose, and her choices had been measured to elicit predictable reactions. The revelation was unnerving. I hadn't just been deceived. I had been part of an experiment in trust and control. The major twist revealed itself fully when I uncovered a hidden folder on her laptop. Password protected, encrypted, and carefully concealed. Hesitant but determined, I opened it. Inside were spreadsheets, logs, and notes detailing my routines, my preferences, even my emotional responses. She had cataloged everything, creating a meticulous profile of my behavior. I realized then that this wasn't about infidelity alone. It wasn't a fleeting lapse or a secret affair. It was about control, observation, and understanding exactly how much she could shape the reality around me while maintaining the appearance of a devoted spouse. The emails, the schedules, the notes, they all pointed to a single, chilling conclusion. She had engineered her actions to see what I would tolerate, what I would overlook, and where my limits truly were. Every inconsistency I had noticed, every odd behavior, every pause in her voice, it had been intentional. I felt the floor shift beneath me. My sense of reality warped as I processed the layers of manipulation. The betrayal had been emotional, intimate, and psychological. It wasn't just a personal violation. It was an intrusion into the very framework of my life. What shocked me further was the audacity of it all. She had maintained a facade for months, maybe years, while observing me in ways I hadn't imagined. The quiet nights, the subtle gestures, the seemingly ordinary routines, all were part of her plan. And yet, amid the shock and hurt, a strange admiration surfaced. not for her intentions, but for the sheer meticulousness of the deception. Every step had been measured, precise, and intelligent. It was a cruel kind of brilliance. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the laptop screen, absorbing the enormity of what I had uncovered. The house around me seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the gravity of the revelation. Sunlight fell across the floor in long, sharp lines, illuminating the silent witness of years of manipulation. My mind raced, cataloging everything I had seen, everything I had overlooked, and everything I now understood. The betrayal had been layered, psychological, and deeply personal. But knowledge had shifted the balance. Awareness was my power now. The twist forced me to rethink every interaction, every memory, every moment we had shared. The dinners, the conversations, the laughter, they were all now filtered through the lens of calculated intent. Even affection had been part of the design, engineered to reinforce the illusion of trust. I realized that the real betrayal wasn't just what she had hidden. It was the truth behind why she had hidden it. It wasn't about a fleeting affair or a momentary lapse. It was about control, observation, and the careful study of my reactions. For the first time, I saw the full architecture of her deception. Every choice, every action, every subtle manipulation formed a pattern that was as complete as it was devastating. And in seeing it, I understood the true scale of what I was facing. The major twist transformed my anger, hurt, and shock into a precise clarity. The betrayal was no longer amorphous. It had shape, structure, and intent. And with that clarity came a newfound sense of purpose. I was no longer merely the victim of deception. I was now the observer, the strategist, the one with the power to navigate the reality she had created. And in that realization, I knew something essential. Understanding her motives gave me the tools to respond intelligently, deliberately, and without losing myself in the chaos she had engineered. The revelation left me shaken, yes, but also sharpened. I understood the depth of her manipulation, and I now understood the path forward. The betrayal had a name, a face, and a method. And with that knowledge, I could finally reclaim agency over the life she had sought to control. The sunlight faded slightly as the afternoon progressed, casting long shadows across the room. And in that quiet, charged space, I felt a hard, focused resolve begin to form, one that would guide every choice I made from this moment onward. The moment the truth settled, I realized that raw confrontation wouldn't serve me. Anger flaring or shouting would only feed the chaos she had carefully cultivated. Instead, I decided to respond the way she had operated, intentionally, intelligently, with patience. Quiet revenge, deliberate and controlled, became my strategy. I began by reclaiming my routines. Small, almost imperceptible changes in behavior allowed me to regain agency over the life she had been subtly shaping. I altered my schedules, shifted my work habits, and created pockets of time where she couldn't predict my actions. Each small adjustment was a way of taking back control, reestablishing boundaries she had ignored. Her reactions were telling. At first, she didn't notice. The coffee I made, the route I took to work, even the order of household chores shifted subtly, and she moved through her day expecting the familiar choreography. When things didn't align, I saw the brief hesitation, the micro pauses, the flickers of uncertainty in her eyes. It was subtle but satisfying. Her confidence was being recalibrated. I also began to document everything carefully, not out of paranoia, but to preserve clarity and ensure I never lost sight of the patterns she had established. Logs, notes, timelines, all maintained with meticulous care, like I had once seen in her hidden files. It was almost ironic, a mirrored strategy of the manipulation she had perfected. I observed her closely, noting not just the mistakes or inconsistencies, but also the moments where she tried to regain composure. Each attempt was informative, revealing how she had thought I would react in certain situations and how far she had underestimated my perception. Yet I didn't confront her openly. I didn't accuse. I didn't allow drama to enter the home. That would have been predictable and predictability was the one thing she thrived on. Instead, I let her see small consequences, a shifted plan, a missing piece of information, a subtle recalibration of our routines that forced her to adapt. It was empowering, seeing her uncertainty in response to controlled changes. I could almost see her mind working, recalculating what she thought she knew, adjusting to the new reality I quietly orchestrated. The balance of control had shifted without her realizing it fully. I also strengthened my support network, friends, family, and confidants who understood only the surface of the situation. Sharing carefully selected information with others gave me perspective, validation, and protection. It reminded me that I wasn't isolated and that I could navigate this betrayal without succumbing to chaos or fear. Her small manipulations began to falter as I consistently maintained boundaries. I responded selectively, choosing when to engage and when to observe. Each interaction became a lesson in self-control, a measure of patience, and a demonstration that I could operate calmly where she had relied on deception. I also reclaimed my emotional space. I allowed myself to feel hurt, betrayed, and angry, but only privately in controlled settings. I processed my emotions with clarity rather than letting them dictate my actions. This self-discipline was a quiet, powerful form of revenge. It denied her the chaos she had hoped to provoke. Over time, she began to adjust her own behavior, sensing that the balance had shifted. I watched her recalibrate, subtly, almost unconsciously. The confidence she once wielded effortlessly was now tempered by the knowledge that I was observing, analyzing, and no longer naive. Small victories accumulated. She missed minor cues, forgot details, made miscalculations she had once been careful to avoid. I noted them quietly, without celebration, simply acknowledging that the truth had leveled the playing field. I also rebuilt my own sense of trust in myself. Awareness, patience, and strategic action reinforced my confidence. I knew I could navigate the home, the relationship, and the lingering presence of betrayal without losing control or composure. Every quiet adjustment, every carefully observed action, every small, controlled response became a layer in the larger strategy. This was not revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was precise, calculated, and entirely in service of reclaiming my agency. By the end of weeks of subtle recalibration, the dynamic in our home had shifted. I was no longer the naive partner. She was no longer operating unchecked. The house, once filled with hidden manipulation, now functioned on terms I established. I had turned awareness into power, betrayal into insight, and deception into strategy. Quiet revenge, measured and deliberate, allowed me to reclaim control without losing myself in the process. The morning sunlight fell through the blinds as it always had, ordinary yet brighter, reflecting a home where balance had been restored, not through confrontation or chaos, but through careful, intentional action. And in that quiet, controlled space, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. I hadn't punished her recklessly. I hadn't exposed her to chaos. I had responded with intelligence, patience, and precision, proving that betrayal could be countered without losing oneself. I had reclaimed my home, my peace, and my clarity. And for the first time in months, I felt truly in control. The days that followed the quiet recalibration of our home were surprisingly still. The tension that had once vibrated in every room settled into something manageable, almost neutral. I moved through the house with a new awareness, each step deliberate, each glance measured, fully conscious of both her presence and my own agency. I reflected on everything that had happened, the envelope, the notes, the hidden files, the months of subtle deception. It was tempting to dwell on anger, to relive the betrayal, but I realized that indulging it would give her control over my emotional state again. The lesson was clear. Power lies in awareness, not reaction. Trust, I learned, is fragile. I had given it freely, fully, without question, and in doing so, I had made myself vulnerable. That vulnerability had been exploited, not maliciously in the ordinary sense, but calculatedly, systematically. My own naivety had been the entry point, and yet the experience also taught me about resilience. Even when the foundation of my marriage had been shaken, I discovered an inner strength I hadn't recognized before. Observing, analyzing, and responding deliberately became a source of empowerment. I wasn't broken, I was awakened. I found myself thinking back on all the small moments that had once seemed ordinary. The morning coffee we shared, the quiet dinners, the laughter in the living room. Those moments weren't lies. Exactly. They were performances layered atop reality. They weren't meaningless. They had served as bridges between truth and illusion. But I now understood the layers beneath them, the hidden mechanics that shaped our life together. I also recognized the danger of assumptions. I had assumed loyalty, honesty, and transparency without verifying them. That assumption had cost me dearly, but it also illuminated an essential truth. Assumptions can be deadly when they replace observation and awareness. Rebuilding trust wasn't easy, and in many ways, it would take time. But I no longer approached life with blind faith. I approached it with measured attention, aware of subtleties, sensitive to incongruities, and prepared to respond intelligently to the unexpected. Awareness itself had become my safeguard. The quiet revenge I had enacted, subtle, nonviolent, deliberate, had restored a balance without escalating the situation into destruction. It proved to me that power could be reclaimed, without resorting to aggression or chaos. Strategy, patience, and observation were far more potent than rash action. I also reflected on how betrayal shapes perspective. I had once believed that deception could only hurt the trust in a relationship, but I learned that it also sharpens perception, refines judgment, and strengthens resolve. The experience, painful as it had been, became a crucible in which my awareness and composure were forged. In practical terms, I re-established routines on my own terms. I moved with deliberate purpose, observed with care, and maintained boundaries with precision. The household operated differently now, not because she changed entirely, but because I had shifted, recalibrated, and reclaimed control of my own life. Emotionally, I learned to distinguish between hurt and reaction. Pain could exist without dictating my actions. Anger could be present without clouding judgment. Clarity became my ally, and it guided every decision I made moving forward. I also understood the subtle power of patience. The betrayal had revealed her methods, and by observing quietly, I had gained insight without letting emotion dictate strategy. That patience had given me leverage, not vengeance, and allowed me to restore equilibrium without creating chaos. The final lesson, perhaps the most important, was about self-reliance. I realized that even within intimacy, even in relationships built on mutual trust, personal awareness and agency are non-negotiable. One cannot fully depend on others for honesty or loyalty. One must maintain vigilance while nurturing connection. I didn't close myself off emotionally, nor did I live in constant suspicion. Instead, I cultivated a balance, attentiveness without paranoia, observation without obsession, strategy without cruelty. It was a state of quiet empowerment, born from adversity and tempered by reflection. Looking back, I see the morning when I first discovered the envelope as the turning point. It marked the end of blind trust and the beginning of deliberate clarity. From that point onward, my life and my choices became intentional, measured, and fully under my control. And now, as I move forward, I carry the lessons of betrayal not as scars, but as markers of growth. I have learned that deception can reveal truths, not just about others, but about oneself. Awareness, strategy, and patience are far more powerful than impulsive reaction. The house feels familiar again, yet changed like the life I now inhabit. Light falls across the floors, ordinary yet charged with quiet clarity. I walk through it with calm resolve, fully awake, fully aware, and no longer naive. Trust, once given freely, must now be tempered with observation. Betrayal, once devastating, has taught me to act deliberately. And in that balance, I have reclaimed my life, my peace, and my sense of self. I am not the same person I was that morning. I'm stronger, sharper, and awake. And that, ultimately, is the truth I carry forward.